Todd Braisted is an author and independent researcher specializing in Loyalist studies during the Revolution. He's published over 60 books and journal articles on a variety of subjects. His website, royalprovincial.com, is the leading site for Loyalist research since it debuted in 2000. He has been a guest historian on various television shows. Over the past 4 decades, he has served as president of the Bergen County Historical Society and the Brigade of the American Revolution, and he's also a fellow in the Company of Military Historians. In 2018, he received the award recognition from the New Jersey Historical Commission, and in 2026, the History Medal from the Daughters of the American Revolution. He has lectured extensively on Loyalists and other subjects across the United States and Canada. So with that, I'd like to welcome Todd Braisted.
Oh, good evening, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay? You folks in the back? Wonderful. Well, number one, thank you, Tom, very much for those kind words. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Historical Society and the library both for hosting this. Last time I was in Monmouth was in October at Brookdale for the big history fest there, which was very impressive. I'm with Bergen 250, the Bergen County's 250th Commission, and also Rev. J's Advisory Council. So I get to see things on both the state and local level. And Monmouth County certainly is leading the way as far as zealousness and patriotism for our 250th anniversary. And it's so heartening to see. I kind of wondered what the 250th would be like. I became a reenactor in June of 1976, so 1 month before the big day, and at the ripe old age of 12. So, yeah. So it's this is the big one for me. I already have other plans for the 300th, so we want to make the most of this one. Now, when they asked me to speak here today and pick a topic, I can think of no better one than the Sandy Hook Lighthouse. I'm assuming where is other way? There we are. I remember going to Sandy Hook with a science class in grammar school or high school, or I think grammar school. We never got to the lighthouse. We went to the beach. We took some sand. I have no clue what we did with it, but it was a fascinating area. Now, one thing they asked was that I not delve too much in areas where Michael might with raids into the county. So we're going to talk tonight about the lighthouse and actual Sandy Hook itself, and what was going on there, not from there into the county. So if you want to hear about all the to-dos in Shrewsbury and elsewhere, that I'm sure will be coming from folks more local and knowledgeable than I. But that being said, this is the New York Lighthouse. The lighthouse was financed and built at the desire of New York City merchants for reasons that seem obvious: the safe arrival of their ships' cargoes. According to the New York Gazette, the lighthouse was lighted for the first time on Monday, June 11th, 1764. They described it thus: the house is of an octagon figure, having 8 equal sides, the diameter at the base 29 feet, and at the top of the wall 15 feet. The lantern, the circumference 33 feet. The construction of the lantern is iron, the top covered with copper. There are 48 oil blazes. The building from the surface is 9-story high. The whole from bottom to top, 103 feet. The article later concluded that it was, quote, judged to be a masterly piece of workmanship. And I think we can all agree with that assessment. In early March 1776, even before the evacuation of Boston by the British, both New Jersey and New York would order the dismantling or destruction of the lighthouse. New Jersey designated Colonel George Taylor of Monmouth County Militia, while New York sent Major William Malcolm to assist. The orders were, quote, to take the light out of the lantern and save it if possible. But if you find it impossible, you will break all the glass. You will endeavor to pump the oil out of the cisterns into casks and bring it off. But if you obstruct it in your task by the enemy, you will pump it on the ground. In short, you will use your best discretion to render the lighthouse entirely useless. They ended up breaking the glass, and the other implements were left with Colonel Taylor for safekeeping. At 4 a.m. on the morning of June 21st, 1776, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Tupper of the 21st Continental Regiment with some artillery pieces advanced secretly to within the lighthouse, which would have been occupied by a few loyalist recruits and some sailors. Tupper and another officer advanced to demand the surrender of the post, but were fired upon. The battle was on. For the next hour, Tupper had his artillery blast away at the lighthouse, but the cannonballs had little effect. At a range of 150 yards, musketry was even less effective. According to Tupper, 2 Royal Navy vessels sailed over to add their artillery to the battle against Tupper and his force. One was the 44-gun ship Phoenix, who hammered away at Tupper for 90 minutes. The Continental force actually had no support from New Jersey. Slide's a little misleading. Tupper complaining to Washington that, quote, I requested. Washington immediately wrote to Tupper to call off any more and being risk. British soldiers would be offshore as the British under General Howe arrived from Halifax. Tupper informed Washington that not a man in his command had received any wound, his surgeon being quite unneeded. What of the lighthouse garrison, though? New loyalist and Major John Antill, 4 years later, wrote in of a needy widow, saying, the bearer hereof, Anne Galbraith, widow of Alexander Galbraith, is an object worth His Majesty's bounty of provision. Her husband, Alexander Galbraith, was a loyal subject of His Majesty and was wounded at the defense of the lighthouse at Sandy Hook, which occasioned his death. The defenders in this engagement receive a mortal wound. Nothing more is known of this possible. He was the only man to die in action at the Hook. Sandy Hook's loyalist garrison could not have been better placed at Monmouth County. Percentage-wise, was only second to Bergen in the number of loyalists within its boundaries. On the screen is a unique roll of what must have been a pre- or early war roll of a grenadier company of Monmouth County Militia, showing all loyalists of one sort or another. Grenadiers were elite soldiers in European armies, known for bravery in battle. Their task of lighting and throwing grenades long over. Monmouth had been purged of anywhere between 60 and 70 loyalists by the state at the end of November 1776. Civilians rounded up and sent to imprisonment in Maryland and Pennsylvania on suspicion they would join the British, who were advancing into the state at the time. Monmouth, Bergen, and other parts of New Jersey and America as a whole truly showed that this was a civil war, not just neighbor against neighbor, but families themselves torn asunder. No better example of that was New Jersey's royal governor, William Franklin, ordered imprisoned in June 1776 by the Continental Congress, a body which included his more famous father, Benjamin. As we will see, Monmouth County would find very tangible ways to assist the British on their arrival. The first real organized garrison of the lighthouse started in the fall of 1776. On October 14th and 16th, 48 members of the 3rd Battalion Delancey's Brigade under Captain Charles Hewlett arrived from Long Island on board the 14-gun Royal Navy sloop Swan. Delancey's was a 3-battalion brigade authorized in early September 1776. Under the command of Brigadier Oliver Delancey of New York, the battalions were raised primarily in Queens and Suffolk counties on Long Island. It is interesting to note on the roll shown on the screen, it simply says Loyalists from Queens County, not even acknowledging the corps they belonged to. So new was it in the military. The men of the 3rd Battalion Delancey's were replaced about a month later by an equal number of the 2nd Battalion of Delancey's, recruited primarily in Suffolk County. With each detachment had been sent a British engineer with some artificers to both repair the lighthouse and build a fortification around it. At some point, a 5-gun battery was added just outside the works to defend against hostile shipping. The documents shown here and on the previous screen are from ship muster books in England. Every Royal Navy ship kept such a book to show who was drawing provisions on board. The British in this respect were meticulous in paperwork, and we like that as a researcher. This also shows the British were using warships to facilitate the garrison movements of the lighthouse. That would change, much to their chagrin, later in the war. The area around Sandy Hook, despite the presence of the Royal Navy, was fertile ground for rebel privateers. Privateers were not government warships, but rather privately owned, financed, and crewed, receiving a license known as a letter of marque to attack and capture enemy shipping. The ships and cargoes would then be sold and the proceeds split amongst the owners and the crews. They could make people rich, and often did so. Privateers feasted on unarmed merchant vessels and avoided at all costs heavily armed Royal Navy vessels. They were there to make money, not win glory. Sometimes, however, a small merchant vessel was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Occasionally, the weather intervened and led to unintended consequences. Such was the case on December 13th, 1776, when a French schooner ran aground on the Hook. HMS Siren, the Royal Navy ship, landed her Marines and took possession, capturing 3 very unlucky Frenchmen. That same day, however, the Siren also took on board 27 loyalists from Monmouth County and elsewhere, including a future captain and sergeant major. That captain and sergeant major would serve in the 2nd Battalion New Jersey Volunteers, a part of the largest provincial regiment raised by the British in the American Revolution. These were soldiers on what they called the provincial establishment. The British had raised provincials in all the colonial wars fought in North America. In fact, there were more American provincials fighting against the French in the French and Indian War than there were British soldiers in America. They thought it would be the same in the American Revolution, and they raised thousands of provincial forces. The New Jersey Volunteers would become the largest provincial regiment in the American Revolution. Provincials were armed, clothed, paid, disciplined, fed, everything the same as regular British soldiers. Their term of service was to be for the war and not longer. These were full-time soldiers. They weren't going home at the end of the night. They weren't militia. So there was a lot going on with these troops. There would be 6 battalions of New Jersey volunteers raised by the end of 1776. They were all supposed to be between 500 and 600 men. Most of them never achieved that. By the end of the war, however, they managed to raise 3,300 officers and men, not all of them from New Jersey. From December 1776 to May 1782, the garrison of the lighthouse would be exclusively drawn from the battalions of New Jersey volunteers stationed on both Staten Island and Long Island. The number of officers and men would be roughly the same as that which the Lancys had provided. The 2nd Battalion NJV had initially replaced the Lancys in December 1776, till they were replaced by men of the 1st Battalion in May 1777. Those men would remain at the lighthouse for a good year before being replaced. Afterwards, it was more or less a monthly or 2 months rotation, so no one spent too much time there. The 3rd Battalion NJV provided the fewest men, less than 30, under Lieutenant John Hatton, before they embarked for Georgia late in 1778. This is a wonderful map from the Clemens Library at the University of Michigan. It is in the Sir Henry Clinton map collection, and it is online if you care to peruse their maps. They've got over 500 of them online. The work to the upper left, you see that where it says C, that I believe is the 5-gun battery. The map is dated 1779, but in all likelihood represents how the post looked starting in 1777. That little circle in the middle there, that's the lighthouse. And that is the bastion fort around it. That is where the 40-man garrison would be. And that was there the whole war. While not covering the many raids launched from Sandy Hook, especially those by refugees later in the war, I would be amiss in not explaining that some of the early ones were for purely military reasons. Among the most significant targets were the many salt works along the shore. Salt was the leading preservative of the day and an essential commodity in preserving provisions for the use of the army. Damage that supply, and you damage the enemy's ability to sustain warfare. Given the number of Monmouth County men in the 1st and 2nd Battalions of New Jersey Volunteers, they were essential in finding and destroying enemy salt works the first half of 1778. This is when the war gets interesting and things strategically change for the British. Sir William Howe, who had captured New York and Philadelphia, was going home. He was being replaced by Sir Henry Clinton. The French entered the war. The British ministry ordered Clinton to radically change British policy in America. They were going to cut 40% of his forces so he could reinforce the West Indies, East Florida, West Florida, Nova Scotia, send an expedition to take Georgia, all this sort of stuff. He had to move his army from Philadelphia, evacuate Philadelphia in June of 78, march it across New Jersey. I'm sure all you folks have been to Monmouth battlefield, fight the Battle of Monmouth, and then make it to Sandy Hook before the French trapped them. So he was able to do that all successfully. Arriving off Sandy Hook by the night of July 12th was Vice Admiral Charles de Comte d'Estaing and his French warships, about 20. They were at sea since April of 1778. Amongst them was his 90-gun flagship, one of 80 guns, 6 of 74, 3 of 64, and 1 of 50 guns. And it was far more powerful than the poorly manned British fleet of 6 64-gun ships, 3 of 50, and 2 of 44. If d'Estaing had been earlier, he might have blockaded the British in the Delaware before Philadelphia could be evacuated, but that was not to be. Due to the draft of the heavier ships, the French were unable to sail safely into New York Harbor. The local pilots are the people who know the area, know where it's shallow, know where the bar is, know where to lead ships, all refused to risk the attempt. The British, for the moment, were safe, although they did not realize it. Sandy Hook had been the embarkation point for the New York after Sir Henry Clinton's army had marched across New Jersey from Philadelphia. While Clinton won a strategic victory in moving his army and baggage across an enemy country, he had still lost hundreds of men by desertion, heat, and battle. The British were forced to evacuate because of the French. Sir Henry would need to redeploy his men, as we discussed a few minutes ago. Arriving just before the French fleet, the Hook was a hive of activity, with hundreds of men fortifying against a French attack. Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, that happy-looking person on the screen, commanding the brigade stationed there, wrote on July 15th, quote, "The possession of this post I conceive to be of the greatest importance, as it enables Lord Howe, under its cover, to take a position that puts him upon a level with the French fleet, by being obliged to pass the bar by single ships, would be beat by our fleet in detail. But were the French masters of this island, they would, by erecting batteries, oblige our ships to quit their present advantageous situation and move higher up the bay. The enemy would then pass the bar, unmolested, and attack Lord Howe in line of battle. I must therefore take the liberty of repeating that I conceive the post to be of the very first importance, and that an immediate considerable reinforcement is necessary." Cornwallis differed in opinion. He looks a little more confident. Lieutenant General Lord Cornwallis, Sir Henry Clinton's second in command, appreciated everyone's concern, but saw no need for any further troop movements. Writing to Sir Henry on July 17th, he stated, "I found O'Hara very uneasy. I could not examine the island, but from what I know of it, I cannot conceive any reason for his being so. Lord Howe expressed himself very strongly on the importance of the post, and said that if the French fleet came in and possessed it, it would not be in the power of the whole navy of Great Britain to relieve us. However, as I cannot say that it is in any immediate danger, I have not thought it necessary to give any orders to the 2nd Brigade." We mentioned Sir William Howe had gone home. He had been the Army commander. Well, that's his brother. That is Admiral Lord Howe. Writing from his flagship, the 4-year-old 64-gun ship of the line Eagle, Howe informed Clinton, quote, "Colonel O'Hara acquainted me with your sentiments respecting the reinforcement of the post at the Hook, and the purpose of sending off another packet. I do not presume to form an opinion of the force requisite, or the mode of applying it to the best defense of the post. I have only meant to urge the importance of retaining it, and for anything that yet appears, I should conceive the numbers purpose. Howe's warship ready to rake any French warships attempt to cross the bar. Remember, he said they would have to do it singly. If they somehow survived that, there were batteries ready on both sides of the Narrows and then Governor's Island. There were 2,500 French soldiers with the fleet. They most likely would have had to land at Navesink first and then cross over to the southern tip of the Hook, all the while under fire, rather than some Normandy-style invasion like the British at Kips Bay in 1776. Okay. By way of full disclosure, that is not Lieutenant Colonel John Morris in the illustration there. There are no known portraits of him, so I had to quickly find some other suavely good-looking individual to take his place. Howe went on to say, quote, Lieutenant Colonel Morris is busy in collecting intelligence of the position of the French Guard upon their watering parties. He means, I find, to be more particular in his inquiries, as from the matter he has already collected, it seems practicable to make a successful attempt upon their post. The person he was referring to was Monmouth County's John Morris, the Lieutenant Colonel Commandant of the 2nd Battalion, New Jersey Volunteers. Starting in April 1777, his battalion had been selected to augment the undermanned Royal Artillery, meaning he would be doled out in small detachments all over the New York garrison, including a few at Sandy Hook. It also meant many of his officers had little to do, as the detachments did not require officers of their rank, especially a lieutenant colonel. For this reason, and given his knowledge of the Hook, Morris was on hand there to lead the British around, give them the lay of the land, both on the Hook and what lay beyond. This map shows what the British looked like at this time in 1778. The lighthouse is all the way up at the top, all right? It is difficult to see. I understand this is the best I could get. There are 4 regiments there. They are 3 British and 1 provincial. The British are the 15th, the 44th, and the 46th. The provincial regiments, the West Jersey Volunteers, a battalion of New Jersey Volunteers raised primarily in Salem, Gloucester, and Cumberland. So they are there. There's also towards the bottom, it says Grenadiers and Light Infantry. They're probably the Grenadier and Light Infantry companies of the 3 British regiments on the island. So about 1,600 officers and men to repulse a French invasion. So they're strung out there along the breadth of the Hook. By the way, once the French realized that they couldn't get over the bar, they sailed away. No one knew where they went for a brief time until they showed up off of Newport, Rhode Island. They got some tourist guides. They heard good things. Of course, Rhode Island happened to be occupied by 5,500 British troops at the time, but that is a different lecture, not the one for here. One of the 2nd Battalion soldiers at Sandy Hook was Private Jacob Wood, except he wasn't supposed to be there. He was a deserter. Kniphausen on the northern tip of Manhattan when he deserted in February 1778. He was discovered at Sandy Hook and ordered under arrest on August 3rd, 17th. Marshall is worth reviewing as it gives us much great intelligence about the time the French being there the previous month. And these are directly from the court proceedings. Quote, the prisoner, being put upon his defense, said that whilst he was at Fort Kniphausen, he received a letter from his wife, who lived in New Jersey, acquainting him that she was in distress, upon which he came from Kniphausen to New York with a pass to get leave from Colonel Morris to go to the Jerseys, but the colonel refused him leave and bid him go back. That he crossed over from Kniphausen to Jersey, i.e. deserted, and carried his wife and family to Sandy Hook about the 1st of May last. That whilst he was there, Lieutenant Parker of the same regiment came down, and he immediately went on board the sloop where he was and desired that he would acquaint his colonel that he was there, and begged that he would obtain leave for him to stay. That Lieutenant Parker went up to New York, and upon his return told him that the colonel said that he might stay there till he sent for him. The Colonel Morris himself was backwards and forwards to and from the Hook, and that he, the prisoner, used constantly to supply him with fish. That he also got a pass from him to go into Jersey, where he stayed a week. And whilst he was there, the French erected a work on a hill and were watering their fleet near Shrewsbury. That one of his neighbors desired him to go and give General Clinton intelligence of it, and he accordingly set out for New York, and Colonel Morris went with him to General Clinton's, and afterwards returned to the Hook in the same sloop with him, and supplied him with fish as usual. But having affronted the colonel by going a-fishing without leave, he ordered Captain McLeese to take him up. That's an interesting defense. The court found him guilty of desertion, quote, but having given himself up and been afterwards employed on different occasions by Lieutenant Colonel Morris, instead of being immediately apprehended and brought to trial, the court is of a further opinion that this implied a pardon and gave the prisoner reason to regard it as such, that they therefore cannot, under these circumstances, proceed to sentence or adjudge the prisoner any punishment. Who says there's no justice? Wood served faithfully for the rest of the war till he was disbanded in Nova Scotia in 1783. Quote, at the commencement of the late unhappy dissensions in America, he was comfortably and happily settled in Middletown, Jersey, but was enabled to maintain his family with decency and reputation. So said George Taylor. Taylor had, to all appearances, been a good Whig, having served in 1776 as colonel of the 1st Regiment Monmouth Militia. When the lighthouse had been disabled in April, some of the parts were kept at his house. That was until November 28th of that year, when he resigned his commission with the British approaching. Among those with the British was Cortlandt Skinner, who, in addition to being Brigadier General of the New Jersey Volunteers, also held an older commission of Major General of New Jersey Militia. On December 18, 1776, Skinner commissioned Taylor colonel of, yes, you guessed it, a new Monmouth County militia, this one fighting for King George. The new Monmouth militia lasted only a couple months, the British withdrawing to New Brunswick, Perth Amboy, and of course, Sandy Hook. It was at the Hook that Taylor would spend much of his time for the rest of the war, serving as a guide and spy. In June 1779, he received a warrant to raise a company on the provincial establishment, the same as the New Jersey Volunteers. It was to be raised, quote, in the defense of Sandy Hook and places adjacent. It was to consist of one captain himself, one lieutenant, an ensign, 3 sergeants, 3 corporals, a drummer, and 53 privates. He claimed to have enlisted 20 men before he was taken prisoner under a flag of truce at Shrewsbury in early August 1780. Taylor was eventually exchanged for Major Matthias Halstead, who had been taken prisoner by Loyalists in March 1780. Upon his return, Taylor resumed his activities in the Secret Service, but nothing ever became of his intended company. It is not known what happened to his recruits or if they, in fact, ever existed. The company would have freed the British from detaching a company's worth of troops from elsewhere, weakening that regiment significantly. The winter of 1779-1780 was described then as the worst in human memory. Waterways all around the region froze solid, effectively making islands no longer islands. This was proved quite convincingly when Continental Major General Lord Stirling marched 2,700 troops with cannon across the ice from New Jersey to attack Staten Island. The ice did more than eliminate Staten Island's water barrier. It likewise connected the British post at Sandy Hook to New Jersey. The garrison at this time, consisting of about 40 men from the 1st Battalion New Jersey Volunteers, commanded by Captain Lieutenant James Nealon. This detachment was not rotated for months due to the ice. Continental partisan Major Henry Lee, that handsome-looking on the screen, and his legion were at the Jersey shore and coordinated a plan with Washington to try and surprise the garrison. Lee did not lead the attack, entrusting it instead to Captain Henry Peyton. The garrison forcing the Legion to change its plans. As Lee reported to Washington, quote, "The noise of the men marching, occasioned by the snow, alarmed the garrison. Of course, the attempt on the lighthouse was omitted, agreeable to orders. The shipping were assaulted, and 3 burnt, viz. 1 tender, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop, and taking prisoner their 12 crewmen. Hard for ships frozen in ice to get away." On April 13th, 1780, the Royal Navy 20-gun ship Galatée chased and ran aground a Rhode Island privateer of 8 guns just 1/2 mile south of the lighthouse at Sandy Hook. By chance, there was a larger than normal detachment of men of the 1st Battalion New Jersey Volunteers there, led by their old commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Elisha Lawrence of Monmouth County. Lawrence and his men were there to capture a secret detachment of the 2nd New Jersey Continentals at Squan, awaiting delivery of black market blankets from New York City. Watching the action at sea, Lawrence took a detachment of his men down to the wrecked privateer and rounded up its crew, consisting of 4 officers and 47 sailors. It would be the largest single capture of prisoners by the battalion in the war. Lawrence's raid on Squan would not happen until April 22nd, when most of the Continentals had already marched off, leaving Lawrence only about a half dozen to bring off. The day that that ship ran aground at Sandy Hook, another privateer that was with it was also captured by the British. They had sailed in tandem, and both were captured. So the Rhode Island, which had been evacuated by the British before this, lost 2 privateers in one afternoon. Not a good day. Things would get better, though. Warships being in short supply, the 40-man garrison at Sandy Hook generally traveled by unarmed private vessels. Thus, the detachment of men drawn equally from the 1st and 4th Battalions of New Jersey Volunteers under Captain Joseph Crowell were taken prisoner on board the schooner coming from Staten Island, just off Sandy Hook, on September 24th, 1780. The schooner and prisoners, along with their captors, on board the port of New London, sending them. Some would never return. Bet you heard of this guy. No one individual on the British side seems to draw more attention than the escaped enslaved man Cornelius Titus. Born into slavery in the household of John Corliss at Colts Neck, Monmouth County, he escaped from that situation and at some point joined the British. Calling himself Thai, it is said he joined the Ethiopian regiment raised by Lord Dunmore in Virginia in 1776. But there really is no definitive proof of that due to a lack of records of that unit. The Americans said he did newspaper accounts, but that may have simply been to associate him with armed blacks. Thai was at Sandy Hook at least during the period of 1779 to 1780. Gathering other black refugees at the Hook, Thai led them on raids into Monmouth County, with his followers bestowing upon him the title of colonel. He was not commissioned any rank by the British, nor would any British commander at New York City have any idea who he was. They were not regular soldiers. They were not paid, not uniformed, armed, fed, or anything else by the British, living off plunder for their needs. It was on one such raid in 1780 where Thai was shot and mortally wounded. His followers would continue acting in conjunction with white loyalists in what some called Refugee Town, probably on the southern part of the Hook. But no new leader would emerge to take his place. His exploits, though, would long be remembered, being featured in many a Monmouth County militiaman's 19th century pension application. The refugees at the Hook would mostly come under some form of organization in early 1781 with the creation of the Associated Loyalists. Seeing a need to unite Loyalists politically, something long neglected, the Board of Associated Loyalists was created for that purpose. In addition, they would create their own army and navy to act independently of the British command, as they perceived the war was not being waged aggressively enough to bring victory, and that Loyalists were not in any way a priority to the British command. The board would act under the direction of its president, New Jersey's royal governor, William Franklin, the leading advocate for a more aggressive war against the rebels. There, see on their left there, that is the Articles of the Associated Loyalists. There was a lot of back and forth going on until that was written, mostly to what Sir Henry Clinton would agree to and what the Loyalists wanted. They really thought that the British were too touchy-feely when it came to putting down the rebellion. It wasn't the British who were having their homes confiscated. It wasn't the British being privately hanged and executed and whatnot. But so that is what really irked the Loyalists to want a more aggressive policy. As soon as the Associated Loyalists received their charter and worked out the details with Sir Henry, attention was turned to raising men to fulfill their goal as a private army, separate and distinct from the British and under Loyalist political leadership. While the main efforts would be centered in the area of Long Island's North Shore, known as Lloyd's Neck, Sandy Hook would also provide a convenient and relatively safe stronghold from which to not only raid into Monmouth County, but draw recruits from there as well, as each captain was from that county. On January 15, 1781, the board issued a warrant to Clayton Tilton, and 3 days later, one to Richard Lippincott, to raise companies of Associated Loyalists. Clayton Tilton was a native of New Jersey and lived in Shrewsbury with a wife and family. For joining the British in December 1776, he was found guilty of high treason and his property confiscated. By 1780, Tilton was acting as an ensign out of Sandy Hook, but by whose authority is unknown. He was credited with capturing Colonel John Smock and Hendrick Smock. Richard Lippincott was likewise from Shrewsbury and had been confined in Burlington jail as early as October 1776 for harboring a suspected loyalist. After breaking free, he joined the British and shortly before his 32nd birthday, commissioned an ensign in the 1st Battalion New Jersey Volunteers in December 1776. For reasons unknown, he resigned from the Corps just 5 months later. In May 1779, he became a lieutenant in the 1st Battalion King's American Rangers under Robert Rogers, but does not appear to have actually joined the Corps. He too appears at Sandy Hook, no doubt working in concert with Tilton. The companies of Associated Loyalists were to consist of a captain, lieutenant, ensign, 4 sergeants, 4 corporals, and 46 privates each. They would receive no uniforms or pay from the British, and only occasionally arms, ammunition, and food. Tilton's company appears to have been already complete on the day of his warrant, as his commission was dated the same day. Lippincott would associate 52 men under his command, receiving his commission on February 17, 1781. His lieutenant was John Woodward and his ensign John Irons, both of Monmouth County. Woodward would leave the Associators in August 1781 to take a commission in the 1st Battalion, New Jersey. The entire episode of the capture and execution of Captain Joshua Huddy would require its own lecture. For our purposes tonight, it was a matter of retaliation by Loyalists for the death of Philip White, an Associated Loyalist. The Loyalists asserted White was brutally murdered after his capture in April 1782, while his captors said he had been killed trying to escape. Captain Joshua Huddy, of the New Jersey state troops had been captured in battle by the Associated Loyalists at Toms River in March of 1782 and was released the following month to be exchanged. Under the care of Captain Lippincott, Huddy was instead hanged within 6 miles of the lighthouse in Highlands. Pinned to his body was a note that stated, quote, "We the refugees, having with grief long beheld the cruel murders of our brethren, and finding nothing but such measures daily carrying into execution, we therefore determine not to suffer without taking vengeance for numerous cruelties, and thus begin and made use of Captain Huddy as the first object to present to your views, and further determine to hang man for man as long as a refugee is left existing. Up goes Huddy for Philip White." The affair was decried by everyone involved. A British officer selected for retaliation, and Lippincott court-martialed by the British. Despite being found not guilty, the British revoked the charter of the Associated Loyalists by the end of September 1782, effectively ending their military career. The association of the New Jersey Volunteers with Sandy Hook ended in May 1782, when the Corps moved from Staten Island to Paulus Hook, modern Jersey City. Its immediate successor would be a regular British unit, the 57th Regiment of Foot. Brigadier General Skinner sent the post's new commander, Captain Lieutenant John Shack, detailed instructions on what he was expected to do and not do. Among them were these, quote, "You are to be careful that the men do not stroll about the Hook, but that they are always near the lighthouse, and one half always within the pickets in the day, and at night the whole in the house and within the pickets, except the necessary sentries and pickets, and a sentry in the lantern for day. No expedition in conjunction with refugees or others are to be made without permission, nor are covering parties to them or others coming in to be advanced beyond the gut, and at the greatest caution, and only in the day, none at night." These orders, in the heat of the moment, were instantly forgotten. Captain Adam Hyler, one of New Jersey's leading maritime partisans, was sailing back from an excursion with 2 armed whaleboats when he was spotted from the lighthouse by Captain Shack. Shack immediately raced towards the gut and 25 men to intercept him. While technically not leaving Sandy Hook, all things considered, Shack should have let him go on his way. Hyler, realizing his tactical advantage, landed a party of his men and ambushed the British, capturing Shack, a corporal, and 7 privates. Shack's second in command, Lieutenant Sinclair, led a relief party of his men and British Marines, but Hyler and his prisoners were long gone. In reporting the incident to the new British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Guy Carleton, Skinner lamented, quote, "It surprises me, as my instructions to him could not justify his march." Shack resigned from the army upon his exchange in 1783. General Skinner had a grudging respect for Hyler, further telling Carleton, quote, "The daring things he does demands attention to him, and as he has ranged for a long time and grows more daring, I wish he may be stopped in his career." With the war winding down and the British ceasing all offensive military operations at New York, Hyler looked for easy waterborne opportunities. He found one: fishermen. Not being allowed to make raids, many of the refugees turned to fishing to earn a living. One such fisherman captured was Ezekiel Tilton, whose wife pleaded for assistance from Sir Guy Carleton, writing that July, quote, "that while he hath endeavored to gain a subsistence in the occupation of a fisherman for the support of his family, last week in returning from the banks without Sandy Hook, they were in the Narrows overtaken by a rowboat fitted out in New Jersey, carried to Monmouth Jail, and confined, it is reported, as a state prisoner, so much oppressed with close and heavy fetters that his flesh is in a state of mortification, in which apartments one of his neighbors hath heretofore been shot and murdered without provocation, and others led to the gallows for their loyalty, while he is daily reproached and threatened to share the same fate by his obdurate keepers. Carleton did, in fact, bring it up, writing to Washington on September 12th, quote, "Partial though our suspension of hostilities may be called, I thought it sufficient to have prevented those cruelties in the Jerseys, avowed, which I have had occasion to mention more than once." He needn't have worried, as the thorn in his and General Skinner's side was dead. Adam Hyler, dying 6 days before from a, quote, "tedious and painful illness." Standing orders for the post stated, quote, "Deserters from the enemy, soldiers from the convention or Lord Cornwallis's army, and other persons coming in from the country to reside are to be sent to headquarters on this island as soon as you can conveniently." Hundreds did just that during the war. It also proved a convenient place to desert from, if one was so inclined. On July 23rd, 1782, Michael Meany, a soldier of the 22nd Regiment, which had replaced the detachment of the 57th at the lighthouse, deserted his post. He was brought back by Captain Clayton Tilton and one of his men, Joseph Price. Meany was court-martialed, found guilty, and sentenced to 500 lashes on the bare back with the cat of nine tails. The actual court-martial proceeding said, '83, the garrison continued its normal rotation of troops, this time, though, utilizing more provincial troops. One of those was the American Legion, although its famous commander was already in England. That on the right, of course, is the famous commander of the Loyalist regiment known as the American Legion. Anybody recognize who that is? That is Benedict Arnold. Yes, Benedict Arnold raised a regiment and named it the American Legion. I would not recommend you mentioning that at any Legion post in the county. The evacuation of New York City is one of the great untold logistics stories of the war. British Commander-in-Chief Sir Guy Carleton, in an age before modern communications, had to coordinate sending German troops to Germany, British troops home or to other garrisons in North America, all the ordnance stores and supplies, and most of all, what to do with tens of thousands of loyalist children, amongst whom were some 4,000 formerly enslaved blacks, including those who would serve. But not all equally. Some 55 prominent loyalists, including our friend George Taylor, would seek grants of 5,000 acres or more based on their pre-war status. Hundreds of loyalists petitioned Carleton to reject that claim. The military would receive grants commensurate with their rank, 100 acres for a private, 1,000 acres for field officers. No one would get more than that. Each dependent would receive 50 acres. The nightmare came upon the realization that most of the land, particularly that in what in 1784 would become the new province of New Brunswick, was not surveyed, and that no land could actually be granted until that not so minor detail was rectified. Over 1,100 men, women, and children of the New Jersey Volunteers would be among those departing, a number of whom had served on Sandy Hook. Many of the old associated loyalists, disbanded since the fall of 1782, would also be leaving. Richard Lippincott departed in the spring of 1783, settling at Beaver Harbor, New Brunswick, while Clayton Tilden likewise settled in the new province. He is said to have died there in 1808, shot by a British Army deserter. The remnants of the self-styled Black Brigade, Colonel Tighe's old group, departed New York in July 1783 on board HMS L'Abondance. This was a Royal Navy vessel, as opposed to the civilian transports which carried the bulk of the evacuees. On board were a total of 410 Black men, women, and children, destined for Birchtown, a Black Loyalist settlement a few miles from the much larger Loyalist settlement at Shelburne. Here they would receive, mostly, grants of land, but much smaller amounts than the white Loyalists nearby. Not all would go there, however. Isaac Allen, the former lawyer from Trenton turned New Jersey volunteer lieutenant colonel, wrote from New Brunswick at the end of 1783, requesting assistance for one of them. Quote, George Black, a free man, his wife and 2 children, came with me to this place. He has long been free and was one of the brave fellows who served under the gallant Colonel Tighe. I think he deserves provision, as well as other refugees. If you should be of the same opinion, pray be so good as to say a word for him. While equality between the races did not come about in 1783, perhaps it took a small step in the right direction. You've probably seen that on the left if you've been to Sandy Hook. You may not have seen who was originally under there. The Honorable Hamilton Douglas Halliburton met his fate at Sandy Hook in the final day of 1783, just as the evacuation of New York was drawing to a close. He was a young British naval lieutenant, only 20 years old, commanding a barge from HMS Assistant, a 50-gun ship, when several sailors deserted into the marshes along the Hook. In fact, it had 2 groups of deserters in consecutive days. It was alarming, and his commander ordered them out after them. Halliburton set out with a small crew to retrieve them, but a sudden winter storm swept across the bay. By the next morning, all but one of the men was found frozen to death on the beach. Described in contemporary accounts as 12 gentlemen and 1 common sailor. In addition to Lieutenant Halliburton, Lieutenant James Champion of the Corps of Marines, 11 midshipmen, and 1 sailor perished. Their bodies were discovered frozen on January 2nd. They unfortunately grounded their barge on a mud bar, never actually really made it to shore. The men were buried on Sandy Hook. The sad story does not end there. His mother, Catherine Hamilton, the Dowager Countess of Morton, erected a marble monument on the west side of Sandy Hook to honor her son and his crew, a gesture of grief that stood for years before being destroyed by the crew of a French warship in 1808 during the Napoleonic Wars. The grave was eventually lost to time until road workers rediscovered it in 1908, leading to the sailors' reinterment at Cyrus Hills National Cemetery, and later the construction of the present memorial in 1937. Today, visitors to Sandy Hook still encounter that quiet reminder of a young officer, a winter gale, and the final human cost of a war that had already ended. Thank you. We have time for questions, yes?
No.
Okay. Anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
Get paid. They still get paid by the start, our new government.
Well, which loyalists are you referring to? Well, which loyalists? The New Jersey Volunteers were regular provincial forces. They were paid as soldiers. They had a paymaster who drew warrants upon the British paymaster who received the money from the British Treasury and white light, and were paid in that manner. Now, the refugees, like Colonel Ty, were not paid. They mentioned they were not soldiers. They were not enlisted soldiers. They were not commissioned officers. They lived solely by plunder. If they went to your house and you being a rabid Whig, going yay George Washington, and they stole your horses and your cattle and whatnot, they would bring those back, sell those to the British, get money, and from that money, buy their food, clothing, shelter, that sort of thing. But the regular soldiers, like the New Jersey Volunteers, were paid through the Army via the British Treasury Office as normal. That answer your question? Certainly. Yes, in the back. That's an excellent question. I do. Oh, the question was, are any other British cemeteries on Sandy Hook? That I do not know. Now, certainly somebody had to have died there during the course of the war. Forget about being shot, all right? Illness killed 9 out of 10 men on both sides during the war. So smallpox was not a fun thing, but prevalent. So people died all the time. Where they were actually buried, I'm not aware of finding remains elsewhere. I imagine since there was so much being built in the 19th century and in the 20th century for the military and the Coast Guard, that they had to find something somewhere. But I don't know of anything offhand. There's certainly no marked cemetery saying, these are British soldiers or anybody else for that matter. So not that I'm aware of. Yes, ma'am. Is there anything left of the fort around the lighthouse? Not really. I can say that with some authority because I went to the lighthouse a few years back where Dr. Richard Veit of Monmouth University was having a field class archaeology there. And they were digging all around where I didn't have that map when I was there. I didn't know of that map when I was there, but that's where they were digging. And there was, as far as the ground itself, no. And the British probably would have leveled that fort. It was a minor work. It wasn't that big. Leveled that before they left. And it doesn't appear that the Americans afterwards rebuilt it for any reason. And so over the course of 250 years, it doesn't look any different than anything else. They found a few things there, the archaeology class, but not a great deal, not what you might expect. Or at least not what I would have expected. So, yes.
Remove the land in a lighthouse. When was it replaced?
It was, yes. The question is, since the oil was removed from the lamps, was it replaced? Yes, the lighthouse was in operation shortly after, probably by the end of 1776 again. That's the engineers went there with the detachments from Delancey's, not just to build that small fort, but to repair the lighthouse itself. And since George Taylor had saved most of that stuff in his house, and since he joined the Loyalists, he had preserved it all and returned it to the lighthouse. So yes, the British fairly quickly. Yes, in the back. Yes. Yeah. As I mentioned, people like Lippincott. The question is, where did the Loyalists who served on Sandy Hook go after the war? Yes, that's where they went. That's what I was talking about. People like Lippincott and Clayton. The fleets were going back and forth between Nova Scotia and New York starting in October of 1782, even before the preliminary articles of peace arrived in New York City in April of 1783. The preliminary articles of peace actually said the states would not only cease confiscating loyalist property, but would return it to the loyalists. Now, of course, the United States government at the time was governed by the Articles of Confederation, which could only suggest earnestly to the states that they do this. And of course, the states said, that's very funny. You guys in Congress have a sense of humor. And no one did. So, yes, many of them had little choice. So the British actually evacuated anywhere during the course of the war and at the end of the war, not just from New York, but from the South and upstate New York and the frontiers and Massachusetts, somewhere between 60 and 80,000 loyalists. It was the only place the British were. If you want to join the British, what was the old criminal who said, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. So if you want to join the British, you go where the British are. People always think that the British Army was this big army. I still see it today. The most powerful military in all the world or all of Europe. The British Army was amongst the smallest of Europe. You look at France, you look at Prussia, you look at Austria, you look at Spain. The British Army was dwarfed by all of those countries. The British Army, when the war broke out, was approximately 42,500 men, scattered throughout England, Ireland, Scotland, Jamaica, the West Indies, Gibraltar, Minorca, India, and North America. All right. They had so many places to defend. I heard a professor once say, well, if that was the case, what was the most important British colony? And he said, oh, I'll tell you the three most important British colonies. Number one, Jamaica. Number two, Jamaica. Number three, Jamaica. Okay. So what the British had was a large navy, not a large army. So they needed loyalist troops. They needed to hire Hessians in Germany, which they had done before in previous wars. King George III, of course, was German. He was from the House of Hanover. So he had control over the electorate of Hanover. But more to your point, trying to arrange all this shipping was simply done by letter. All right, you had to write a letter, no email, okay? No satellites circling above with instantaneous communication. Try explaining that to kids today. Yeah, exactly. Well, why can't they just, take this out and, send an email to London, send more ships? No, this in the 18th century will take 6 to 7 weeks to get to London and twice that getting back. So that's something that's getting harder and harder for people to comprehend as we get more technologically savvy. Yes, sir. That is the original lighthouse. Yep. That is 1764. That's it. So I went there with my reenactment group in 1989 for its 225th anniversary. But yeah, that's it. And that withstood artillery fire. So you've been inside, go inside. When it's open, I would not recommend going inside when it's closed. That's illegal. So, and I in no way condone that if this is being recorded. But definitely go when it's open next time. And it's fantastic. I've gone all the way to the top. I was much younger at the time. I wouldn't do that again. But and the view from the top is incredible. It's absolutely incredible. Let's get the thing.
Loyalists in Monmouth County, were there more loyalists than rebels?
Were there more loyalists than rebels in Monmouth County? I'd say probably evenly split. Now, Monmouth County was a pretty large and populated county in the 18th century. So numerically, had a lot of people. And so they were able to maintain strong regiments of militia. Monmouth contributed greatly to Hurd's Brigade in 1776. But interestingly, Hurd's Brigade was a 5-month state regiment. And upon their disbanding, some of those Monmouth guys who had served in it immediately joined the British. Interestingly, some of the Clayton family. So probably evenly split. Where I'm from in lovely Bergen County, more loyalists than rebels for sure. They raised an entire battalion for the British, and they provided maybe 24 men to George Washington's army. So Governor Livingston, the first state governor, referred to it as that almost totally disaffected county. So yeah, so Monmouth and Bergen had the most loyal property confiscations in the state by far. Bergen more than Monmouth by 8. So, yes, sir.
On the British loyalists in Perth Amboy.
Were there a lot of loyalists in Perth Amboy? Well, Perth Amboy was the seat of government. That was the capital of New Jersey. That's where Royal Governor's Mansion was and still is. So if you want to go visit the proprietary house in Perth Amboy, I'd recommend doing that. Next month would be the anniversary of Governor Franklin's arrest. So I'm sure they're going to be doing something for that. And so that is where your government officials would be. Say like Brigadier General Skinner, before he was a general, he was Speaker of the Assembly, and he was the last Royal Attorney General under the Crown. He would have been at Perth Amboy. All the government officials would have been at Perth Amboy. So people think loyalists, they think like people like that, whereas mostly they were people like you, just regular people. Okay, last question.
Lighthouse now underground?
I don't know. That you'd have to ask the National Park Service. So, if I was a betting man, I would say yes, because things sink and ground goes up. So probably some of it is underground now. So if you were based on those original measurements, it should be not that hard to do to see, how high the lighthouse is now and compare it to what was reported in the newspaper. And that you could probably tell how much is buried. So I'm going to say you're right. There is some. How much? I don't know. Okay.